Welcome along to the Surrey Virtual School podcast, and thank you so much for joining us. Today's episode is all about care experience and neurodiversity. I'm Helen, Assistant Head Teacher of the Virtual School in Surrey, and we've got two fantastic guests in this episode. Later on, I'll be speaking to Jane Gupta, who leads Surrey County Council's all-age autism strategy, and we'll be able to hear all about that exciting piece of work. But first, I'm delighted to be joined by Rowan, who is both autistic and has experience of being in care. Welcome, Rowan. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're really happy to have you. If you could start by just telling us a little bit about yourself.
Absolutely. So hi, my name is Rowan Foster. I currently work in the NHS as an expert by experience, which is my fun thing that I do. So most of my work is speaking about my lived experience, so I'm quite happy to be here today doing more of that. I went into care when I was 14 and I was diagnosed actually just a little bit before that. And I'm really passionate about talking about my lived experience, about kind of general intersectional advocacy around disability and mental health. I also have a physical disability, and that's kind of linked into my autism, interestingly enough, which we can discuss later, and that impacted on my education in its own way. So yeah, I'm really happy to be here.
Thank you. And just to get us started, what was education like for you?
I was never somebody who had much difficulty academically. I'm lucky enough that I've got quite a good memory and I'm generally quite bright, and I always picked up information quickly. The difficulty for me around school was pretty much everything else. I went through primary school middling. I went to like 6 different primary schools because my family moved quite a lot. My mother had to move away from my father quite young, and so we had to move around the country quite a few times to make sure that we were all safe, and that obviously impacted the way that I formed relationships at school, and that was something that I found really difficult, especially as an autistic person. Learning how to build friendships and build relationships. I very often had to move very suddenly and then wouldn't really get the chance to say goodbye so much, so I didn't really get the chance to form long-term relationships throughout my childhood, which kind of impacted me a little bit later. I coped mostly at primary school. I think it was about year 5 or year 6 that I started to struggle a lot more. So 3 of my changes were in those last 2 years. I started school reviews, I refused to go into school. I had my head teacher turn up at my house once with permission of my family. I would absolutely just refuse, and I was too young at that point to really vocalise what it was that I hated or what it was that was really affecting me. I had friends. I wasn't, completely isolated. It's not that there was anything at school I specifically remember that I really struggled with, but I'd always really struggled with executive dysfunction. I lost absolutely everything at school. I would go in, I remember, especially when I was in like year 5, I used to go into school with a full book bag, and by the end of the term I would have nothing. I would have lost all of it. I'd had like 10 pens, they'd all disappeared. I'd lost all my books, and they'd all disappeared, and my mother would go around the entire school at the end of every half term and find them all again because I'd lost track of them. I think in the younger years you can structure a lot of the socialising with play. You've got stuff that you can all listen to, and it doesn't start to get more cliquey and more stressful until about that kind of year 5 or 6. At least that was what was my experience, especially changing schools a lot really impacted that. So that obviously meant my kind of early education experience, it was easier in those first couple of years, although I remember still having difficulties kind of on a sensory perspective, but it was kind of all I had known. I went into school quite young, and honestly I would just lose myself in books. I learned to read really, really early, so I used to get in trouble for reading under the table all the time. And obviously I've got iPads now, so probably start reading iPad under the table now. So that was something that really helped me. I used to hide in the library most of my break times and most of my lunchtime and just sit in there and read. I think I read every single book in probably a couple of my libraries. So, because I was a really quick reader. I went into secondary school without too much of it. So I'd had to move to live with my father at that time because my older sister had become very unwell mentally, and so both my siblings were autistic. And so I had to move quite suddenly. I was lucky enough to stay in the same secondary school for the entirety of my, from year 7 to year 11. I think that was really helpful for me. That meant that I actually managed to have the same friend groups or the same people around me. I knew who everyone was, I knew the structure of the school, and I was involved with the SEND department, obviously that would be the additional needs department, from pretty much day 1. And so I spent a lot of time there, especially in my early kind of years in secondary school. I struggled to make friends more in secondary school, especially because I'd moved into a different county. I wasn't so familiar with it. But I eventually found my people, most of whom were queer and autistic, which was exactly my sort of people. I started to find those people more kind of year 9. I spent a lot of my first 2 years, again, in the library, read all the books, and so I didn't really speak to anyone my first couple of years. As I got older, and I got a boyfriend and wanted to socialise a bit more, I made more friends then. But academically I was still struggling, but I managed to spend quite a bit of my time in the C15 department. It was kind of difficult because I didn't struggle with learning, but I wouldn't do my homework. And I don't think I did really any homework throughout the entirety of my secondary school, to be honest with you. I was terrified of getting in trouble, and actually that was the approach really. It was, why haven't you done your homework, rather than why aren't you doing your homework? What's the issue here? I reported to my school about what I was going through at home, so I was being abused at home, in about year 9, and I went into school just before year 10. So I went into care just before year 10, and so that was a bit of an adjustment. That was when I started using more of the student support section. I was really lucky that I had a very positive student support section. We had 2 different student support officers. The one from year 7 to year 9 I didn't like very much, and the one from year 9 to from kind of year 10 to 11 was a lot more supportive. And I think especially since I'd then gone into care, I had access to things like, you know, like Black Reviews and PEPs and all of those sorts of things, so I had more support in place. But obviously I needed that support prior, just didn't get it.
So that does actually bring us nicely onto the next question, which is, how did being in care impact your education? So you talked a little bit about school moves, particularly in your primary school years. So how did that, and how did other things about being in care impact your education?
So the first thing I guess that really came to mind was people found out quite quickly. And it was something that I was really nervous about how I was going to approach, but people would ask me questions about it, and the way that I dealt with it was to just own it and be honest about it. When people looked at me, they didn't really see. People have very specific stereotypes about child in care and what they look like, and often that doesn't necessarily look like an autistic person, and it's hard for people sometimes to conflate that you can be more than one. It meant that I think I wasn't pushed as hard as I could have been, and I think being in care impacted that. I think that I'd gone from a position where I was quite a high achieving student, and I still was relatively high achieving, but in year 11 I basically didn't go to lessons for most of the years, and that was really difficult.
Because of the experiences you were having at home?
Well, I'd left then, but it's when you leave the traumatic situation that then your brain goes, now's the time to process it. So that's when my mental health really declined, and it didn't really pick back up again after that during my time in education. So that really affected how I was, you know, I basically just didn't go in. I got so anxious. I couldn't deal with rooms of people. I couldn't deal with, you know, and again, because I'd moved into a children's home at that point, so I was in foster placements for about 8 months before I refused to go back to the second one, because they were just, I had kind of 2 basic rules about how I wanted to be treated. I wanted them to not slam doors, because that really upset me, and not to shout at me, and she did both within like the first week. I spoke to my social worker about it, and they said, sorry, that's not our problem, why don't you wait there for another, you know, why don't you just wait for another 6 weeks? And so I left. And so, because obviously that's not so conducive to finding new foster placements if they know that you've left before. I went into a children's home after that. So the social aspect of that, obviously, you know, you're surrounded by people who you don't know, you live with lots of people you don't know, got lots of different workers coming in and out, because it's obviously it's a residential home, so you know you have shifts, and that it kind of upped the social ante. I had to deal with loads of socialising at home, and I couldn't really hide from it, and I also then had to go into school and deal with large groups of people, and you know, and for me, I used to get into classes late because I couldn't keep track of time, because I was awful at actually kind of, you know, making sure that I had a bit of time blindness, and then I couldn't go in late because I had this real thing about being looked at. It was just a trauma thing, but that then meant that I basically didn't go in. Luckily, I did actually pass most of my GCSEs, God knows how. I ended up with a 9 in English language and a 7 in maths, which I was very happy about, because it was first year of the numbers as well, so we weren't sure quite how it would go. And then the difficulty really came when I went into college. I attempted the first year of college 3 times, arguably 4, but it was pretty much 3 times. The first time I went in, there was a little bit of support, but I think when you hit kind of 17, 18, especially in the care system, that's when your PA, so the kind of personal assistant worker who will then help prepare you for independence. And obviously with the children's home, there's no staying put placement, because once you hit 18, because of safeguarding, you have to leave. So everyone was trying to kind of prepare me for independence, and what they didn't seem to get was that that wasn't really an option for me. And although I'm somebody who's quite articulate and somebody who, you know, presents as really quite low support needs, actually, you know, I've had kind of medium support needs for most of my life, and I've always really struggled with school and with general kind of functioning. And so it was kind of this pushing to, you know, you've got to, so I had to travel to college by train, like for an hour each day, and then walk. And then at this point, obviously I had an undiagnosed physical health condition, which I can talk about a bit more in kind of autistic setting, because it kind of relates to that. So then it was just really impacting. I didn't realise I wasn't meant to be in pain all the time, because no one had ever really told me. And so I just lived my life, you know, all my joints were always really hurting, always exhausted. And then because, again, the difficulty with care is obviously not everything tracks through, and because my home life hadn't been great either, my health hadn't really been monitored. And so that really impacted, you know, I didn't find out about my physical health conditions until it got really bad. And that prevented me from going back to college. The last time I went, I'd come in a wheelchair, and I was like, I can't do this. And the difficulty was, because I was in care, a lot of the disability interventions that schools and education tend to have are reliant on the fact that you have a carer or a parent at home. And I didn't. I lived in independent living, supported living. So it was basically just me. You know, I had a PA, I had a support worker, but that doesn't replace a parent. And it's not that wraparound care. It's not, I had a lot of time alone in my flat, a lot of time not being able to really do very much. And I think when I left care and when I then became a care leaver, that really was when it kind of went, oh, education's not going to work for me. When I went to college, I spent, you know, again, when I was at school, I kind of got away with not going to lessons very much. But then, you know, it was, oh, you're so bright, you have to go to college, you know, it'd be such a shame if you didn't. And so I did go, but my problems hadn't disappeared. And I know there are some young people who get excluded from school. I wasn't. I think maybe because I've been there for so long and because they'd known my difficulty and there was really no point me moving, they were very tolerant of the fact that I wasn't coping at all. And, you know, exclusion was never even brought up as a suggestion. But when I went into college, I think I remember one of the PEP reviews, it was literally this tiny office, and we were there for about 20 minutes, and they were like, well, you're just not attending enough, you know, you're not here enough. And I was there, but I often just wouldn't be in the lesson. And it was trying to get to school, you know, it was trying to get to college and all of these other things. And eventually it just really hit me, and I had a mental health crisis at the end of my first year. And then I couldn't return because I was in hospital and all these other sorts of things. So then I had to move to a different college because I had to move to a different place and all these other sorts of things. And I think I noticed a really big drop from the support that I received at school to the support I received at college. And I think everyone was expecting me to be independent, be ready, and, you know, ready to go. And I just couldn't do that. And I think often the independence that you're expected to have as somebody in care is measured by neurotypical standards. And those weren't my standards, those were what I had. So that obviously really prevented me accessing college. And even though I have a job now, I never got my A-levels, which I was always really sad about, actually, because academically I never had an issue. I was getting, you know, I think my first English language paper I got an A, and because I really loved the subject I did and I really enjoyed college, but I just couldn't do it. There wasn't enough support for me.
So it sounds like, in your experience, that the support that was there for you being in care and being a care leaver didn't necessarily take into account the fact that you were also autistic.
Absolutely, and this is obviously a really huge problem within general service provision. It very much focuses on individual cohorts, but they don't take into account when you kind of hit a few of them. You know, I hit, you know, the mental health, hit the physical health eventually, you know, neurodiversity and care experience. And so they were like, well, we can do one. We can't do all of them. And so you'd have different people and different agencies involved, and all of them offering kind of a little piece of the support that you needed, but none of them actually wrapping around and providing you the care. So I had kind of a little bit of both, and there was interventions in place to do with being in care, but those didn't bear into my disability and being autistic. I had interventions in place for kind of additional needs, but those expected you to have a parent or carer there, because I think it's always this question, you know, they assume that somebody who's autistic and who has kind of medium to higher support needs, or even lower support needs, they must have a parent there, because otherwise how would they function? And it's like, yeah, I agree, but I also don't have one. So that really created a lot of difficulty in terms of all the support there, and it wasn't all joined up, and I know that Surrey has done a lot to work on that, and I hope that that's improved, but I would be surprised if it has improved a lot more. It was quite a long way to go.
So we've talked a lot about how being in care has clearly impacted you and your education, and a little bit about how being autistic has impacted you. You talked about social aspects and making friends and things, but is there any other ways you think being autistic impacted your education?
So one of the really weird ones, so I really struggle with PE. And what I now know, having been to a neurologist, that I toe walk, which is obviously a really common autistic thing. But that meant that I actually physically couldn't run. And so every time I'd go, and obviously I had an undiagnosed physical health condition, but the toe walking was separate, and you can't run when you toe walk because you're literally pushing yourself backwards. And I got yelled at by my PE teacher a couple of times, like, why, you aren't even trying to run. And I was like, I'm really trying, but it's just not going anywhere. And that was a really strange one that, having reflected, I thought perhaps if I'd been diagnosed earlier, or perhaps if after the diagnosis I've been given more support, I might have known about that, but none of those things were checked for. When I was diagnosed, it was kind of, there you go, you're autistic, good luck, have fun. And I'd been in therapy pretty continuously since I was about 11, so I still had CAM support, and then continued to pretty much until I was 18, and I'm still in therapy now as a 22-year-old. And obviously that really impacted trying to function. I was struggling with mental health issues, and it's something like 80% of people who are autistic struggle with mental health issues, yet they'd expect an autistic person to have autism be their only thing, and even if it is their only thing, for it to present in a very specific way. Obviously, women with autism are often diagnosed a lot later, and my brother was diagnosed at about 4. My sister was diagnosed at about 13. My sister, had higher support needs than I did, so there was a lot of difficulty there, and I'd gone through all of my younger education years having no idea why I lost everything all the time, having no idea why I couldn't function, why I hated all of the noise. It's like everyone was speaking this whole other language secretly, and I had no idea what they were talking about, and it's just kind of trying to function. I think one of the analogies that I've heard used about it is something like, if you were born in Spain and you spoke Spanish for your entire childhood, and you came over to England and everyone's speaking this different language, and you can learn it, you can practice, but there'll always be little figures of speech and little things that you miss, and that's kind of how it feels. Even though I've learned how to mask, and obviously not every autistic person can mask, I can, just because of my individual support needs and the individual way that I function. But if I wasn't able to do that, I would have struggled even more. I was kind of lucky that the educational support, the C15 and all of those sorts of things, were generally quite involved with me from the start, and I was lucky enough to have that. But even with that, I could go there when I wanted to, but there wasn't any kind of, I didn't have someone come into lessons with me, because I wasn't the kind of autistic that they thought would need that, because academically I was fine, and that created a lot of difficulty for me, because I needed all the things, but because my grades were fine, they were like, well, there's not a problem because you're getting good grades. But I was like, well, I'm not actually going into my class. I'm barely there, I'm really struggling, and I'd be distracted all the time, and I just could not focus at all, because there would be so much going on around me, and I had to try and socialise. And I got bullied for my earlier secondary schools. I didn't get bullied so much right at the end, I think, because everyone was focusing on GCSEs, but also because I had got older, I'd got more conventionally attractive, and that does help actually. When they see someone who looks and acts more disabled or more autistic, then it's almost like bullies, and especially mean girls. It's like you're like wearing a target on your head, saying, please bully me. And luckily I did have friends, so I wasn't as heavily bullied as I know a lot of other people were. But it's still, I didn't feel safe at school, and it escalated to physical at times, and that was really scary for me, especially with obviously the stuff, the stuff that had brought me into care. But especially when I got into the college years, there was, again, the socialising. As you get older, it gets more and more complex, and so there's kind of a higher burden of proof you have to meet. It kind of goes down a bit again when you're an adult, because people accept weirdness a little bit more, obviously depending, your mileage may vary depending on where you are, but you can find your clique a lot more. When you're in school, I think the thing that people forget is that you can't pick your friends, you can't pick who you're around. You can choose what job you go to, you can choose more who your friends are and where you go. I couldn't really choose where I went to and go to social clubs and things like that. It wouldn't really be my choice because I was a child. Mm-hmm. And now as an adult, I have the freedom to make a lot of those decisions and to go and do those social things. But when it's school, you're stuck in a room of 30 people who you don't get to leave, and it's almost like a pressure cooker when it comes to socialising, and you have to try and figure out how to function and deal with everything around you and not get bullied and not seem too weird, and then also try and do all your education at the same time, and it all just built and built and built up.
It's a lot, isn't it?
It's quite a lot.
So was there anything in your experience that you found particularly helpful or supportive?
So the student support team that I had were really, really good. And maybe I just think they were really good because they kind of let me do what I wanted to do. But actually, I think genuinely that was what I needed. I think they actually listened to me. They understood that when I said I can't go into lessons, I cannot imagine what he would have done if they had tried to force me into lessons more, and if they had tried to punish me for not going in, all these other sorts of things. I think genuinely I would have just had a full-on mental breakdown. I was already on a knife edge, and I think they probably knew that. So I managed to stay out and, function a little bit more. because of that, and I don't think I would have got my GCSEs if I hadn't had that support there, you know. And it was because I guess at that time my more presenting needs were my mental health needs, but I think, you know, the difficulty is that what can present as emotional and mental health needs is not always just emotional and mental. And obviously I think I had a panic attack a couple of times, and the difficulty is I find that as an autistic person, if I'm having a panic attack, I'm having a meltdown, you know, or I'm having a shutdown, depending on the individual situation. And that level of crisis and upset, your autism is going to come into it. And that really, I remember just freezing up and not being able to do anything, and, you know, I was listened to. And I think when they found out that I hadn't been going to PE, they threatened to kind of, you know, put me in isolation, and I had a full-on panic attack. And they went, okay, never mind, we'll put you outside the head teacher's office, you can just sit there, so we've still done something. I had this huge fear of having done things wrong and having got in trouble, and I you know, especially in my earlier years, I was told, you know, I probably had a PDA presentation. I don't know how true that was or how much of it was trauma, but I definitely had, you know, I really struggled with demand avoidance, and any sort of demand or any sort of expectation just absolutely, it completely panicked me. I didn't know how to deal with it. And so the fact that I was given a lot of freedom, perhaps a lot more than a lot of students were given, it allowed me to make my own choices. I think people forget that, you know, children are little adults and obviously they don't always have the same capacity to reason or, you know, same theory of mind, all these other sorts of things. Especially when I was younger, people see children's emotions as dramatic or too big, because to an adult that's a very small problem, but to a child that's massive. That's your entire life, you know, at that point. And even within my teenage years, it was kind of the same. People kind of go, oh, you know, teenagers are always emotional, but, you know, it really was, you know, it's very hard being a teenager. And the fact that they listened to me and gave me agency and gave me choice, I think was the really important part, especially when you're in care. You have so much choice and agency taken away from you. And even though I chose to go into care, I put myself into care because I knew that if I didn't, you know, my livelihood was at risk. I didn't get to choose where I lived. I didn't get to choose who I lived around and who looked after me and all these other sorts of things. So giving agency and choice wherever possible and letting me decide what I needed was really helpful. I just wish that had continued more, and understanding, I think especially education can be a real cookie cutter sort of thing. There's a specific expectation of how you'll learn, how you will go into lessons, and the fact that actually they didn't go, well, you're not going into lessons so you shouldn't be here. They went, you're here, that's good enough, you're in the building, you're speaking to us, we know where you are, and you're trying to learn, and that's enough. That for me was really helpful, just not having the expectation of having to learn and function in the same way as everybody else, and not having, you know, well, these are the rules so you have to do that, and all of these sorts of things. I had more freedom, and I think that more than anything was what kept me in education to get my GCSE. I'm very thankful for that, because if I didn't have those, I wouldn't have been able to get any further.
Yeah. So thinking about other young people who might be in a similar position to you, who might be in care but also autistic, do you have any advice for them at the moment if they're in their education and they might be struggling with some similar struggles that you experienced?
A lot of it is that you kind of have to own it. As an autistic person, you'll be told that your way of functioning is wrong, but the more you're kind of shy about it and the more you're insecure about it, they will notice and they will smell it out. If you go, yeah, I'm really weird, and what? That honestly solved a lot of my social problems, and it really shouldn't have. I should have, you know, not had to have been anxious about it, but there are often lots of other kind of autistic people hiding in the woodwork, you know, go to the library, go to quiet places, it's probably some of them there. I set up a manga club when I was in secondary school, so it's probably some if you got one of those. Finding your tribe and finding your people, especially when you don't have family support, that can be really important. You have to be very careful, because there will be people who might want to take advantage of you, especially when you're in care. You don't always have that support around you, so being open to making friends, but also just keeping a little eye out and making sure that, you know, you're not doing anything you don't want to do. And again, it's really hard, because these are things that it's easy to say, but especially when you're trying to figure out who you are and figure out what you want, you might not know what you want and what your boundaries are. But learning and figuring out what feels comfortable to you, what feels uncomfortable to you, and being confident in that is really important, especially when you get into kind of post-secondary education. So when you go into kind of college, you have to kind of know your rights, because at the same time as there will be people who are going to try and stick up for you, they might not be able to in the way that you need them to be. So making sure you know your rights and know what you're entitled to, and try and fight for it. And you shouldn't have to, you should have someone else fighting for you, but sadly there's often not that person for you, and it gets easier once you got past school. I found that work was actually so much easier than school for me. You know, I still struggle, support needs haven't disappeared, and I still need support and all these other sorts of things, but you can function a lot more as an adult. You have a lot more choice, you have a lot more freedom, and at the same time as it gets harder in a lot of ways, when you reach adulthood you have a lot more responsibilities. It's a lot easier socially, you find your people, and honestly, it does get easier with time.
And that's what's really helped you, is finding your people, your friends, and
honestly, just having the right people around you and having people who love you and being supported and cared for by having the right friends. Honestly, I think that makes all the difference, because it's fun family.
Yeah.
I have an amazing best friend who I go to about everything. You know, I have a partner who I reach out to for a lot now, and I always thought that I wouldn't have friends when I reached adulthood. I thought that my only friends were ever going to be books, and that was pretty much going to be it. All the friends I had would be online, but you'd be surprised how many kind of neurodivergent and autistic people are around, but a lot of them kind of have to hide it. But as long as you can find the right people, that really kind of sealed it for me, especially when you don't have family to support you.
That's so lovely to hear. Thank you so much for sharing all that with us, Rowan. It's been so brilliant to hear about your unique first-hand experiences, and hopefully that is really helpful and insightful for everybody that's listening.
Thank you. You're very welcome, and I hope so.
Thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll see you in our next episode.